So guys, in this video we are going to see how we can take input from a user using Spring Boot or a Spring, you can say, right? There are a lot of ways to take input from a user, but we are going to focus on a simple one. Like, we will create a simple HTML page, and whatever the value you will enter there, it will come to our class, and we will represent that value in the console, and then we will redirect that value to some other page, right? So without wasting much time, let's get started. Okay, so as you can see that we have opened IDE, which is a Spring Tool Suite. If you want to install a Spring Tool Suite, then you can watch our last video, and we have created a complete setup video for Spring Tool Suite, that how you can install it, how you can configure it, how you can customize it, and we have also created some demo project in that, so you can watch that video if you want to install it. Okay, or if you are using Eclipse, then you can also do same thing whatever I am going to do. So as you can see that in the package explorer we are seeing multiple options, right? So we will select a second one, that is create new Spring Starter project. Okay, so it's a service URL, and service URL is basically HTTPS colon start spring.io, right? So whatever the project hierarchy will be created for you, its URL is here, and when you will go to this URL, then you can create your Spring project there also, and you just import it, right? So Spring Tool Suite have given that feature to you. You don't need to go anywhere. You just do configuration here, right? So Spring service URL is this, and name will be code name. You can name is your project name, right? So you can put whatever name you want. So I am leaving it as code spy user. After that, we have option of a type, that is a Maven or a Gradle project. So it's a Maven project, so I will leave it default. And after that, we are working on Java version 8, and the packaging will be jar because a Spring Boot project. If you are creating a Spring MVC project, then you will select it war. And language is Java, and group, artifact ID, version, description, I will leave it default, right? You can change it if you want. I will click on next. After that, we have to add some dependency in our project because we are going to create a web project or a Spring Web project. So we will select this Spring Web, right? Another dependency which we are going to use is DevTools. DevTools is a automation tool to restart your server. Like, we are going to create a Spring project. A Spring project is basically used for a web project, right? So whatever changes you will make in your code, it will reflect it in the browser only when you will restart your project. Okay, so DevTool will help you here. So whatever changes you will make in your code, and when you will save it, then DevTool will automatically restart your server, right? So you don't need to start, stop. All the configuration related work will be done by DevTools. After that, we will just click on next and finish. Okay, so now our project is ready. As you can see that all the folders are created, all the necessary folders are created. So our code will rely in this source pane Java. We will explore it, and com.example.demo if you explore it more. Then we have a class here, code spy user application.java. So it's a main class. Your project will run from here because it is containing main method. Okay, and if you go down, then we have a resources folder. By default, Spring Boot will create some folder hierarchy or a package hierarchy for you, like static, template, whatever the static files you are going to use in your project, you can put it in static. Whatever the templates you are going to use, you can put in templates. And application.property is very important for your project because whatever the static files you are going to use, like we can say sport and some like DB connections, and whatever the fixed content you are going to use in your project, you can put it in application.properties, right? So we will use it. And we have test.java, and it contains JRE files, JRE system library. Then we have Maven dependencies and a source target, right? So now we are coming back to our source in Java, and as you can see that com.example.demo is your base package, right? Because your project will run from here. So according to Spring Boot coding standard, whatever the packages you are going to create in your project, it should be sub package of it, right? Because your project will run from here. So I will follow that coding standard, and for that we need to just right click on this package and click on new, and we will create another package, and we are going to create controller, right? So controller, and click on finish. Okay, so our sub package is created, and in this package we are going to create a class. We will call it a controller class, user input controller. Okay, sorry, and click on finish. Okay, so our user input controller is created, but currently it is a normal class. It's not a controller class, right? So to make it a controller class, we are going to use an annotation which is controller, right? So this annotation will be outside of your class, because this class is going to be treated as a controller class. So you have to use outside of your class, right? We are getting some error here, right? So to resolve it, because it is not imported, so to import it, we just click on control and space. Okay, so we got option and control. We will select the first one and hit enter. Okay, so now user input controller class is configured as a controller, right? So controller class is basically used in Spring Boot to handle request and responses. Whatever the URL you are going to use, whatever the request you are going to use in your browser, all the requests will be handled in controller classes, right? Here in Spring Boot we are not using XML, right? All the mapping you can do from a classes or a controller classes, you can say, right? So for that we are going to create some methods. Public string, and we will put is a user input, right? So now our method is created. Okay, so now a method is created. Now we will make this method for some mapping, right? So we will use some annotation like request mapping. Request mapping. So from name it is clear that request mapping means whatever the request you are going to use in your browser, whatever the, suppose that you are entering some hello, like suppose that you are going, suppose you want to go to some login page, right? So whatever the URL you will enter in the browser, then it's a request. So that request will be mapped from this method. I'm just giving you an example that why we use request mapping, right? So we have to import it also. Right click on it. Okay, so it is imported, and we will put its value. We are leaving it default, and after that we will use a method request method dot get. So whenever you will hit default value in the browser, then Spring Boot will come to this controller class. I mean, give the command to this controller class, and then controller class will search for this URL, that where is the mapping of this value, or where is the mapping of this default value, and wherever it will find, it will returns whatever the method will return, right? So here method is return a string type. So can you imagine that what this method will return? Of course, you can say that the return type of this method is string, so this method is going to return a string value. But do we want to return only a string value, like whatever the value you are going to enter here, that value should be returned in the browser? No, we don't want that. We want that whenever default value or some URL will be entered, then suppose that you have entered the login in the URL, right, in the web browser URL, then what you want? Of course you want login page, right? So this method should return login page, and we are using here a default value, then this method should return some file, And how this method will return some file? So in the string value, we will return the complete path of that file. So you can say that you can ask a question that I haven't created a file yet, then how this method is going to return a file? You are correct. We haven't created, but we will create, right? So we will put any name for a file, right? Suppose that we are going to create some user input file, then we will use it a user input. So we are going to create a JSP page of a name user input. So we will create another folder here and we will name it as JSP. Finish. And inside it we will create file of JSP type. Next. And make sure the name should be same. Whatever the name you are using in this method, like you are using user input, right? So the name should be same. Make sure the uppercase and lowercase, whatever you have used in your class, all the values should be same, right? So we are using user input. Make sure it is user input. Okay, so now click on next, click on finish. Okay, so our user input .jsp file is created. We will remove it. Okay, to suggest to controller that it is a file, we have to add some configuration in our some dot properties file, because all these configuration are going to static, because whatever the JSP files you are going to create for your project, of course it will come inside this folder, right? So the location of the all the JSP file will be the same, so it should be in some static files. So as I already told you that for static contents or static files or static configuration, it should be configured in application.properties file. So I am going to open it. Okay, so first we will define the prefix, and we are going to use prefix suffix for a file. Prefix will contain the directory of the file, like where that file is located, and suffix will contain the extension of the file, that which type of file it is, what type of file it is. Like user input of is of JSP file, then we will define it in suffix, and where user input is located we will define prefix, right? So let's see, spring dot mvc dot view. Okay, so we got prefix, right? So here we will define the path of that file. Okay, so it is inside web.inf, right? And inside web.inf, as you can see that user input is inside JSP. Okay, so inside web.inf, then we have created another folder JSP, and inside JSP we have a user input, right? So it's a prefix, we have defined a prefix. Now it's time for suffix. Okay, spring.mvc dot view dot suffix. Okay, so in suffix we will define the extension of the file, which is what is the type of that file, right? So its type is .jsp. Okay, now we will save it. Okay, now the controller know that what is user input and where it is located, because we have defined in application.properties file, we have defined its suffix and prefix, so what is it and where it is located. Now when the controller will come to this method, and when this method will execute, and when this method will return a string value, then that string value will be a file, right? So when this method will return user input, then the user input.jsp file will be executed in the browser. Okay, and we will create a simple form here. So I have already created it, and I will just paste that form here. I will show you. So inside the user input, we have created a form, right? And this form is containing two input. First one is your text. I mean, first one is of text, and second one is also a text type, right? So in the first input, we are asking to a user his first name, and in the second input, second input field, we are asking to a user that what is your last name, right? After that, we have created another input type of submit, like we can say it is a button, right? So when the user will click on submit button, then this form action will execute, and in this form action we have put a URL that is slash submit, and its method is type of post, right? Okay, so our first step is done. We have created a user input controller, and we have mapped our default, for default value we are returning user input, and inside user input we have created a form, and this form is having two fields. The first one is for first name and second is for last name, right? So when the user will click on enter, then it will be submitted, right? But one thing we are missing here, that is, as you know that Spring is a web project, right? So it will run on some port, so we haven't defined its port. So for that we need to go to that application.properties file, and we will define the port here, right? So we are going to use server.port, and we will put it 8080. We have done all the steps for first step, so we are going to run our project, right? So we will go to this code spy user application, and we will right click on it, and we will run it as a, you can select Java application or a Spring Boot app, right? Okay, so our application is running and its port is 8080, which we have defined in our application.properties file, and our application is running, right? So now we will go to a browser and we will see the effect, right? So in the browser, we will type simply a local host, because our application is running on local host, right? Localhost, and we have a specified port 8080, and after that we will use a default value, that is slash, right? So we have done a mapping of slash in our request, in a controller class, and we have used a request mapping, that when a user will put a default value, then that method will return a user input file or a user input.jsp file, right? So 8080, and we will use default value, hit enter. Okay, so our application is running, and whatever form we have created in the user input.js file, it is reflecting here, right? So we will enter values in the first name and in the last name, right? So in the first name we will enter Rahul, and in the last name we will enter Kumar. And when we will click on this submit button, then we are going to get error. Why you got this error? Can you guess? Yes, you are right. Because we haven't configured this submit. For a default URL, that user input you have configured your controller class. But for a submit, did you configure something? No. So for that, we have to create another method in our controller class, right? Okay, so come back to this class, user input controller, and we will create another method to handle that mapping, that to handle that response that a user is sending from that browser, right? So we will just copy this method. Okay, and we will do some changes here. Now guess what is the value of this request mapping? You're right. This value will be submit. Okay, and this method of this request mapping will of type post, because we are sending some data from the browser. Okay, so we will put another name, user. We can say response. Okay, and we will create another page here, response. Okay, and we will go to this JSP and right click, other JSP files, next, and the name should be same. user response. Now click on finish. We will put the title user response, right? And we will put its title as a user input. Okay, so we will create simple div tag, and inside div we are going to use two paragraphs. And inside it we will show the value entered by the user, right? First name and last name. Okay, so now we have created a user response. So now it's time to get values from a user, like whatever the value user will enter, we want to show those values in our console, right? So to map those values, to get those value, we are going to use model, right? So model is nothing but basically used to hold data sent from a web page or a browser. When the user will enter some data, then it will be added as an attribute to model, and we can use that attribute wherever we want, right? And that model we are going to use in this parenthesis. So first we will import it. Make sure it comes inside Spring Framework.ui, right? Okay, so on the user input, we are using normal forms, right? So we will use the name of the input types that which are holding values, right? So we will go to that user input page and we will scroll down and we will see what is the name of this input type. So as you can see that the name of this input type is first name, right? So we will use this first name, and another input is of type last name. So we are going to use these values there. And this value will also be in this parenthesis. So it is of a string type. So we are going to create a string type of variable, and the name should be same first name and string last name, right? Okay, so to show these values on a console, we will simply use system.out.println. We will. So in the first println, we will show first name, and in the second one, we will display the last name, right? Okay, so now go back to the application or just stop it and restart it. It's not needed, but you can do it if you want, because DevTools is already doing it for you, right? So now application is running. Now we will go to this browser and we will go to again its default value and click on enter, and we will again put some values like Rahul and Raj. Now we will hit enter submit. Okay, so now this URL is working, but the value which you have entered on that page, it is not coming up here because we haven't configured it yet. We have just configured it to show on the console. Now go back to that application, and on the console, as you can see that whatever the value you have entered, it is coming up here, right? So on the console you have printed your values. Whatever the first name we have entered Rahul and the last name we have entered Raj, it is coming up. But it is not going on that submit page because we haven't configured it yet. We have just created a model, but we haven't added those values in the model. So to add those values in the model, we will use a model attribute, right? So we will simply call a method model dot add attribute, right? And the first section of the parameter will contain the attribute name, and actually attribute name which you are going to use in your another page, and the second parameter will contain that particular attribute, right? So first parameter we will simply use first, and this will contain your first name. So as you can see that this first name is coming here. Variable name should be same here, right? First name is added as an attribute to the model, and this model is same that you are using here, right? So first value, first name is added, and now it's time to add last value. So we will call same method again, add attribute, and we will put the string name last, and last name is fine, right? Now first name and last name is added as an attribute, right, to this model. And to access these values on another page which we want to access on our user response, now we will go back to that user response.jsp page. To access model values on a JSP page, there is a simple syntax that you can use. Like first we will create a dollar, and we will use curly braces, right? And inside that curly braces you will put that attribute name, right? So for first name you have defined attribute name first, and for a last name you have defined last. Okay, so make sure it is same, first and last. These names should be there, right? Because it is an attribute which is holding your object value, or your variable or a first name, and this attribute is holding your last name, right? And we will run our project again. Okay, so now go back to the browser and again hit enter and go back to the default page, and now put some value here. Like if I put Spidey boy, now click on submit. Okay, now you are getting your values on another page. So it's working, right? Is that what you want, or you want something else? I want only this, so I did the same. So it's a simple thing. So in this way we can take input from a user. In the next video we will see another type of taking input from a user, right?